All right, good afternoon. Welcome to my afternoon session here on the introduction to creationist biology. I'm interested in talking about sort of the biggest picture we can, the nature of science and how it relates to biology and how that might produce some sort of biology that is consistent with creationist beliefs. Before I begin, I thought it would be appropriate to address those who are perhaps watching at home. I am probably best known now for appearing in the movie as Genesis History. I was the guy that was interviewed at the zoo. And I just wanted to make sure everybody understands that I'm not a zookeeper, and I don't work at the zoo. Really nothing to do with the zoo. I like to go to the zoo and look at animals, and that's fun. But I am not myself a zookeeper. I run a creation ministry in the other end of Tennessee from the zoo we went to, and so I'm not really part of the zoo. So just wanted to clear that up. Had a lot of comments about how good the zookeeper was in the movie. All right, so creationist biology. So first of all, before we can talk about how to build a creationist biology, we have to think a little bit about what is a creationist. I try to keep my list of creationist essentials to sort of a minimum here. Creation a few thousand years ago, historical Adam and Eve, fall into sin with a curse on creation, global flood, historical Tower of Babel. These elements are all derived from the basic creationist belief that Genesis 1 through 11 is telling us something important about the history of the world. It is not simply a mythology or some sort of narrative theology, whatever you want to call it. The narrative there is actually intended to tell you something about history. And I think that is the thing that marks off a young age creationist from others. So these are what I think are kind of important for making someone into a creationist. And in that sense, I can look back through the history of the church and I can find other people who believe very similarly to what I do, and we'll talk about that a lot then in future talk, I think tomorrow. I'll talk more about the history of creationist thought. But that's basically the idea there with the essentials of what it is to be a creationist. Now, those essentials are really kind of a bare bones thing, right? So if you're a biologist, you have lots of questions about things that might not find any real answer in Genesis 1 through 11. So, for example, what did the original created organisms look like? If you were there, if you took your time machine back to the Garden of Eden and you were there watching Adam strolling around naming things, would you really recognize the kinds of creatures that he was naming? Or would you not? And if you didn't, would you even recognize Adam? I don't know. These kind of questions that I would have. How did animals get from Ararat to islands? So that's a really interesting question. If the global flood scoured the entire earth, and now we can go out to islands like Hawaii or the Galapagos, which are hundreds and even thousands of miles away from the nearest mainland, and sure enough, there are native animals there, land animals. How'd they get there? And again, that's not something you're going to find from the Bible. Big question, of course, that Darwin raised, and actually was being discussed a lot prior to Darwin. Do species originate by a secondary means? Do they always, have they originated only by creation? Or is it possible that some of the things that we think of as species have originated by some other means? And if that's the case, then what is that other means? And not surprisingly, the Bible doesn't seem to care anything about where species come from, other than God made everything in the beginning. And one of the other questions that I'm personally interested in as part of my dissertation, if not evidence of evolution, then what does biological similarity mean? Why is it that my cat and I both have backbones and the same sort of arm bones and the same sort of leg bones and those sort of things? If that's not really telling us about our great ancestor that descended and produced cats and people, then what is it telling us? Now, I don't want to overstate things. This is not that Genesis doesn't tell you anything about these sorts of questions. It clearly does. It's telling you a lot of things about these sorts of questions. It's giving you the basic outline of the things that happened, within which you sort of have to come up with your explanation for what these things are, how you might answer these questions. So in a sense, you have, on the one hand, this sort of high-level doctrinal idea of creation that may or may not relate very easily to the real world. So really what we're interested in science is how do we take these high-level ideas, some people call them paradigms, some people call them core theories, various ways of thinking about it, but they're basically these really big conceptual guiding principles that determine the sorts of theories that you would choose to do and to work with in your lab or in the field. And so my question here is, well, if I'm going to be a creationist and I believe in the doctrine of creation, then how does that relate to the real world? Now we can take some hints here from the way people think about evolution. So evolution has a core concept that is really, really entrenched in evolutionary thinking, and that is the common ancestry of all creatures on this planet, and they have evolved slowly over millions of years. Actually, millions of years isn't even necessary. Over a long period of time, whatever that time might be. Millions of years, that's a geology question. Just long time. And that core concept there, that high-level idea, is supported by a variety of evidences, most of which were summarized in Darwin's Origin of Species in the back half of the book. The front half is where Darwin explains the mechanism of variation and selection. The back half is where he says, this is why I think evolution explains things. And those evidences, homology and classification and rudimentary organs and fossil record and biogeography, those are all the kinds of things that you would appeal to support the contention that all living things on this planet have come from a common ancestor. Now, that still leaves you with an important issue, and that is, well, how do you get that descent with modification idea down to something that you can use, right? And over the history of evolutionary thought, there have been a number of proposals, and some of them I've listed here, some of them you've heard of, some of them I bet you haven't. They're pretty weird and obscure things that have been proposed. And the last one on the list, variation selection, that was Darwin's concept, and that's the one that sort of won the day. So, at least currently, has won the day. It could change. And the key here is that it could change, right? There have been other ideas about how evolution might relate to the real world, and in the future there could be more. I have no doubt that there will be more as evolutionary biologists continue to think about species and their relationships. And here's the thing, there's important corollaries that we have to take from this line of thought. One corollary is that attacking this sort of low-level theory doesn't really do much for the high-level thing, because they're different sorts of arguments. The first half of Origin of Species is about variation and natural selection. And that's a totally different kind of argument than what you encounter in the back half of Origin of Species, where he's arguing for wide-scale evolution, that if natural selection and variation goes on unlimited, then you'll end up with common ancestry of everything, and this is what you can explain with that. The irony of that, that organization of origin, Darwin in his introduction basically said, I'm going to write it this way because I don't think anybody's going to accept evolution if there's no credible mechanism. And for, let's see, 70 years after the publication of Origin, well, a little bit longer than that actually, there was an extended debate about what the mechanism actually was. There was a lot of dispute and disagreement about variation and natural selection. Lots of people didn't think it could do what Darwin said it could do. And they still accepted evolution. And that's the trick. So there are a lot of people out there who want to go after evolution and say we have to refute variation, random variation and natural selection. Random variation and natural selection can't explain anything. Okay, that's fine, but what you're going to end up with is a different sort of evolution. Because the kinds of arguments people use to support common ancestry and evolution are just fundamentally different from the kinds of arguments that they would use to support variation and natural selection. So Darwin's organization of origin is actually wrong. You don't have to start with the mechanism and then just infer everything from there. You can actually start with the high-level idea of common ancestry and evolution, which is historically exactly how it happened, and then work out the details. Second corollary here is that you can argue about the lower level details without ever thinking about the high level details, right? So I just said 70 years after Darwin, before the neo-Darwinian synthesis, people were arguing and there was lots of skepticism about variation in natural selection. And in the world of creationism, there are plenty of people out there who seem to follow the creationist literature and find it really compelling to drag out, here's this quote from this creationist and this quote from this creationist over here, and they contradict each other, and so creationism is bogus. But that's silly. That's exactly like dragging out quotes from this evolutionist here and this evolutionist over here, and they contradict each other, so evolution must be bogus. We know that's not right, and we know that the argument that creationism is bogus, just because creationists disagree about it, that's not right either. We're free to talk about these things. We can all hold to those doctrinal essentials, and still some people might say, well, I don't think, Dr. Wood, I don't think your ideas about horse created kinds are right. Okay, cool. We're still creationists. Hey, that's good. It doesn't mean that the whole notion of young age creationism is somehow endangered or threatened by these sorts of disagreements. So going back to the doctrine of creation then, there's various ways that one could argue for the doctrine of creation. My favorite being, that's what the Bible says. But you could also argue for the beauty, the efficiency, or the complexity. The basic evidences that creationists point to as design evidences, right? There's a great deal of complexity, there's beautiful efficiency to what God has made, and it's beautiful. There's this inspirational reaction that scientists have when they get starting to talk about their stuff. It's quite a thing to behold when you sit down at lunch with a talkative scientist and ask him about his research and just watch him go crazy all about some weird thing you may never have heard of, and you might think, wow, that's weird. But there's that passion, right? And that passion comes from that reaction that people have to things that God has made. I think that's a compelling argument for creation. But again, that doesn't necessarily tell me about salamanders or fossils or particular fossils or anything like that. It simply tells me that God made the world. And so I kind of divide up biology, at least biological origins, into sort of 5 categories here. And these 5 categories we're going to talk about right now very, 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 very briefly. And I would love it if you would, pop over to my blog, Google me. I'm the #1 Todd Wood on the internet right now. It's pretty exciting. I finally beat out Todd Wood, the used car salesman, so that was a pretty momentous day. So check me out, learn more about this, because this is going to be real quick and real fast. But the 5 areas: design, natural evil, systematic speciation, and biogeography. Those are the 5. And It's just my way of thinking about things. You can come up with your own categories. In fact, I have come up with alternative ways of categorizing things as well. Some ways of thinking about creation that are a little more centered on God and His holiness and His character, and a little less centered on the evidence and the data that we see in nature, which is what this is all about. All right, so what are we talking about here? So design, why is there similarity? In the world of creationism today, when you talk about design, most people are going to think about Bill Dembski's idea about the design filter, that you have things that are caused by natural law and events that are caused because of just chance, that just happen. And then you have this smaller category where you have extremely low probability events and some sort of specification, which then leads you to infer there is a designer at work. That's great. That's not what I'm talking about. My interest here is the design writ large. I want to know, why is the world the way it is? It is perhaps an impertinent question. I wonder about this often. Am I being impertinent asking this sort of question? Because really the answer is in the mind of God, right? I am asking God, why did you make the world the way you did? Why did you make dinosaurs when you knew they were just going to go extinct? And yeah, that sounds impertinent when I ask it like that, but really, isn't that a relevant question? I mean, there's a lot of dead things in the fossil record that we don't have alive today. Why is that? Why did you even bother making them when you knew they were just going to die? That's an interesting question, and that's related to the question of design. Natural evil, where do harmful things come from? So one of those essentials in creationism is the notion that the fall into sin, when Adam and Eve ate that fruit and God found them hiding in the garden, He cursed creation, and He cursed it with death and suffering. We don't have time to go into all of that. I'll have another lecture here later in the week where we'll talk about that, so I encourage you to come back for that one. But yeah, I mean, so there you get things like, disease-causing organisms, predators, anything that causes physical death in this world, well, presumably had a different sort of existence before there was physical death, right? Makes sense. So where did they come from, and what were they like before that? Biosystematics, then, what is the created kind? This, to me, is one of the most fundamental questions that we can ask, and it's all kind of tied up together with the rest of it, but it is, I think, very important for us to figure out, all right, well, what is this thing that God made in the beginning? If I was in the Garden of Eden, what would I have actually seen? Would I have seen zebras and donkeys and horses, or would I have seen some critter that looks vaguely like a horse, but is not any of our modern horses? What did Adam look like? Was he a white guy with short cropped hair? Was he a, medium brown guy? Did he have curly hair? Did he have straight hair? What was he like? Would I recognize him? And that's related to this issue of created kinds. Speciation, then, where do the actual species that we have come from? And I don't think that's as simple as just saying, well, there's these variations that happen, and over time they accumulate and produce different species. I think it's much more complicated than that. We'll talk about that here in a second. Then biogeography, how did organisms end up where they are? Especially the question of island biogeography, how do you get those animals out to those islands? And indeed, when you think about it, we're on a really big island right here, right? So North and South America are continents that are physically separate from the Middle East, where Ararat is supposed to be. And so the animals dispersing from the ark, how did they get over to this continent? All right, so let's talk a little bit more about design. As I mentioned, I have a different view, and I'm using design in a slightly different way here. So the common way of thinking about it is God is sort of intervening in a regularly ordered series of events. If God hadn't intervened, this would have happened, but God intervened, and this is what happened. It's an interesting way of thinking about things. I like to think of it more in terms of, well, God made a creation that we occupy now, There are all sorts of aspects to it. There's the way the Earth is built. There's the way the way the Earth is laid out, not just where it is in the solar system, but it has continents that occupy certain places, and presumably there was an original continental configuration that was different from ours and occupied a different configuration. That's part of that design. The difference here, I would say, is sort of the difference between looking at a painting and trying to make an argument that it is an actual painting painted by a person, versus looking at a painting and going, wow, what is this artist trying to show me? And what is this artist trying to tell me? Is this a picture of a flower? And if so, what does this mean? It's just a very, it's the same thing in a sense, but it's very different. All right, so some creationist explanations. So biological similarity being the major issue here in biology anyway. So there's lots of organisms out there that have lots of traits. As I mentioned, cats and people share skeletal features. We could go back to even more deeply than that when you look into the genetics and you find out animals share a common set of genes. Mammals, for example, share a common set of genes. And even people and bacteria have genes in common. And we're told that when you arrange them on this sort of evolutionary tree that they all make this really nice phylogeny, they call it, this evolutionary tree that shows you how things are related. And the reason there is similarity among organisms is because we are all related. That's why we have similarity. So how do we explain this? There are a number of creationist explanations that have been proposed. The easiest one, the simplest one, the one that I think appeals to people sort of on a gut level, is the common design argument, right? So the evolutionist says, look at the common structure in the arm of the cat and the arm of the person. They must share a common ancestor. The creationist says those are two common designs, indicating that the cat and the human had a common designer. And that's true. No question. I can't argue with that. There is reasonable, logical validity to that inference. You can't rule it out. If similarity is sufficiently significant that it didn't happen by chance, then you either, in biology, it happened because there's a common ancestor or because God made it that way. Right? So common designer works. Common designer, however, is nonspecific, and that frustrates me, because that I can understand that the cat leg and the human leg have the same skeletal structure because of a common designer. Fine. Well, then why doesn't everything have a leg like that? Why don't jellyfish have legs? They have a common designer too, right? I was designed by the same thing that designed the jellyfish, so why don't we have legs? We all have legs. And there's something missing there. There's something not quite enough to the common design argument, because it doesn't tell me specifically why the design is the way it is. We could go on. Another reply to this is the functional requirement idea, that, and this is really more something that we hear about in biochemistry, this notion that, well, we all occupy the same world and we have a common ecosystem, and so we need to have common biochemicals. So that's why we all have proteins, and we all have DNA and lipids and all these sorts of things, and they're all basically the common exchange. It's like monetary currency, right? It's like money. So we all, here in the United States, we all accept dollar bills, and dollar bills are the way we exchange our work for food, housing, whatever. It's that common currency. And that gets you the common currency, but it doesn't get you, well, why is it that the proteins are actually similar, right? So why is it that the protein of a bacterium is similar to the protein of a human being at the level of the sequence of the protein? That doesn't have to be similar. As long as they're using amino acids and it's digestible, then it fits the functional requirement, and it doesn't really have to be similar at all. So once again, we have this annoying problem of non-specificity. And after a lot of work and a lot of thinking about this issue and a lot of watching what was going on in genomics and watching how people are reacting to that, I've come up with this other idea that is unfortunately non-specific as well. But let me explain it, and I'll tell you why I think it's possibly a little bit maybe better, at least for the future. And the idea here is that communication contains the same sort of similarities that we can view in living things. So when you think about something that's written, for example, this slide is written, it has words on it. And some of those words are used again. You see consistent is used twice. You see non-specific several times because we have a limited vocabulary. And so we use the same words over and over again. And the alphabet is an even more limited set of characters that we use to represent sounds in our words. And then when you actually listen to someone talking like you're doing now, there's a certain number of sounds that I'm making over and over again, and I string them together in order to make words, so that, and you know what they mean, and that creates meaning. But the key here is that if you actually took a text and compared it to another text, as long as they're written in the same language, you're going to find a lot of surprising similarities. You're going to say, wow, look at all the similarities. If you don't know how to read the text, then you might not realize what those similarities mean. You might think, oh, they must be related to a common ancestor. Which isn't exactly right, is it? I mean, sometimes texts are related to common ancestors, sometimes they're not. If you have students who cheat off each other, then you might find texts that are absolutely related to a common ancestor. But otherwise, two papers from two different students that are written on the same subject, they're going to have a lot of similarities. They're going to use the same sorts of vocabulary. They're going to have conceptual ideas and things like that because they're communicating the same sort of thing. It has nothing to do with ancestry. It has everything to do with what I'm trying to say. What's cool about this is when you look at how God creates in the Garden of Eden, he goes around and says, let the earth bring forth grass. Let the earth bring forth living things. Let the sea teem with living creatures. And so, that's intriguing. So you have God making things by speaking them into existence. And now we look around at living things, and they have all these weird similarities that are really interesting. And they kind of look like the sort of similarities that you encounter in language. And just like in language, if you're not careful, you might come to the wrong conclusion about ancestry. I think the same thing is happening here, where if you're not careful, if you don't know how to read it, you might conclude the wrong thing, which is kind of cool. It's non-specific because it still doesn't tell me why my cat and me have a backbone. But if there was a way to understand the language, then you might be able to understand why you and your cat have a backbone. And you might be able to understand things like this. This is Sinornithosaurus. Sinornithosaurus is a feathered theropod. See all that fuzz? Those are feathers. Those are teeth in its beak, and that is its forelimb, right? It is not a bird. It is a dinosaur, and it has these funky feathers. And the evolutionary biologist looks at this and says, aha, here it is, evidence that birds evolved from dinosaurs. And my response is, but this is the exact kind of creature that you would expect if creatures are made according to some sort of language, if there's some sort of communication happening here. These are not intermediates, they are in fact mosaics. Let me give you an example. And the key word to remember here is modularity. So when we look at language, we find evidence of modularity. We find, for example, in this slide, I have 171 words here that I have made from the set of letters found in modularity in language. You take those letters, you rearrange them, and you can communicate all sorts of different things. For example, time, dime, and lime can all be spelled from modularity in language. And you know, because you know English, that time, dime, and lime are really different. Totally, completely different concepts. But you might think, if you were only counting letters, that they're extremely similar, right? They have shared high degree of similarity, right? They must be homologous. But they aren't anything alike. The reality of what a time, a dime, and a lime are, that's not anything alike. And I think that's what we're seeing in organisms. We're seeing God taking design elements and repackaging them and repurposing them to make creatures. And the result is this really complex array of similarities that, if you squint and you don't really understand it, sort of looks like an evolutionary tree, but is in fact not an evolutionary tree. It's something on a whole different level of complexity and mind-blowing amazingness. Now, what do we need to do then with this idea? Well, we need to think more about how we can apply it. I'm really intrigued with microbial genomics. I think that's a very tractable system to work with because there are a lot of microbial genomes, and they're easy to work with. They're small. So I'm really interested in trying to figure out ways of applying linguistics, code breaking, syntax detection, all that sort of thing. Trying to figure out how to package the information that we have from microbial genomes and make it workable with something like code breaking. But the potential outcome here is really important because you know, if you have a text where a word has been smudged out and you're reading along, you can usually figure out what the smudged out word is, right? Because you know how language works and you're following the argument or the sentence or whatever, and you hit the word that's missing and you just figure, well, that must be this word. And sometimes it's not. Sometimes it might be an important something or other that's missing and you're not quite sure what it is. But there is a predictability to the way people speak. You kind of can guess where they're going. And so your brain is listening. As your brain is listening to me, some of you might be actually getting impatient and thinking, I wish you'd hurry up because I'm already thinking ahead and I know what he's going to say. Aha, because language is predictable. And if organisms are actually part of a language, a divine language, then we could theoretically predict their form, which means we could suddenly say, yeah, you should find feathered dinosaurs, and you should also find hairy dinosaurs and other sorts of dinosaurs with other weird characteristics, because that is what the design says we should find. Not what evolution says we should find, but what the design says we should find. That would be an amazing day. I would be very happy. Now, natural evil, moving along here. I usually, for my students, boil this down to the 4 Ps of natural evil: predators, parasites, pathogens, and poisons. These are oversimplified, but that's okay. And the basic concept here is that if there was no physical death of humans and at least some animals prior to the fall, then looking around at our world today, we see things that cause death. Well, they must have been doing something else before the fall. And so how did they turn into what we find them today? And there's been a number of ideas that have been proposed. One idea being a degeneration from a beneficial state, where you have, and all of us know about that as we grow older. You young students will find out soon enough, things degenerate over time. Your teeth don't work, your knees don't work, whatever. And so that could be a source of pathology, source of natural evil. Transgression of intended ecology, you could imagine a system where things were set up to live in particular areas, and after the flood, when everything got scrambled together, now we have organisms encountering one another that weren't really intended to encounter one another, at least not in the way that they do now. And so it produces bad stuff. You think about that. Those of you who live in the South know about kudzu. Grows all over everything, came from Asia, and now is invasive and horrible. And that is an example of something that is moved from an ecology where it was easily controlled to a world where it is not. And finally, this notion of redesign. There's always those critters where you look at them and say, there's no way that was designed to eat a salad. Rattlesnakes, for example, with their heat-sensing pits, their venom injection systems, these guys aren't going after eggplant, right? They're clearly made to find plump little mouses and chipmunks and squirrels and eat them. And for us to say, well, you know, they were vegetarian before the flood, that's really not getting at the essence of what a rattlesnake is. There's got to be something more to what's going on here. So my favorite example here, natural evil, is anthrax. Anthrax is a horrendous respiratory disease, usually strikes people who work closely with animals. Anthrax is caused by a bacterium called Bacillus anthracis. It lives in dirt. And because it lives in dirt, it has this amazing ability to form endospores. It packages up all of its cellular contents in a little spore, and that is able then to survive periods of dried out weather. And then the rain comes and the spore sprouts again, and the bacteria goes on living. It's pretty cool. Imagine if you could just shrivel up into a spore and then resprout when conditions were better. That would be pretty awesome. So this is what the anthrax bacterium does. Now, what's bad about that is you breathe the spore in and it germinates in your lungs. Now the anthrax bacterium can get into your bloodstream, and once it's in your bloodstream, it's got this really cool coat that allows it to evade your immune system, and it begins producing toxins. And those toxins kill your cells, and it does it pretty quickly. So within a couple hours of breathing it in, you feel ill. You feel like maybe you got the flu or something, and the flu gets worse. And as the hours go by the time you realize there's something really, really wrong with me, and you go to the doctor, it is literally too late. Anthrax can kill you within 24 hours of breathing that spore in. That's how fast it progresses. This is a very bad thing. But what's interesting about anthrax is that whole soil thing. If this anthrax bacterium stayed in the dirt where it belonged, you didn't breathe it in, there'd be no problem, would there? So there's this sense automatically right away that you have this bacterium that's perfectly harmless in its environment, so long as it stays in its environment. And when it gets out of its environment, then it can cause all sorts of havoc. Now, that's not the whole story of anthrax, of course, because it makes toxins. This is a protein complex produced by anthrax, the anthrax bacterium, and it's kind of cool. You see that it's kind of like a donut with an opening in the middle, right? This protein can set down on the surface of your cell, and then it acts just like a hypodermic needle. It pierces the cell membrane, and it injects into that cell another protein that is the actual toxin, and it's called lethal factor. And guess what lethal factor does? Well, it's not nice, it's lethal. So lethal factor comes in and kills the cell because it's injected in by this amazing molecular hypodermic needle. Now, lots of questions come up at this point. Where does this hypodermic needle come from? Where does this molecular system come from? And what's it doing? And what's cool about it, though, is I can totally imagine, because it acts like a hypodermic needle, I can totally imagine a world in which anthrax has a hypodermic needle to deliver something helpful. Right? Because today we have hypodermic needles that can deliver medicine to keep you alive, or that can deliver poison to kill you. It just depends on what the hypodermic needle is doing. So I can imagine, and there's lots of things that you can imagine about this. You can imagine a world where anthrax doesn't kill all your cells, but the hypodermic needle is specific for cancer cells. Boom, now you have an anti-cancer agent that's natural. You don't even know you have cancer, you just occasionally breathe in some anthrax spores and whatever might be cancerous in your body is killed. Bam, you're all healthy now. Wouldn't that be cool? Or what if it wasn't lethal factor that was being injected? What if it was something else entirely? What else could it be? I have no idea. That's the thing about hypodermic needles. They're nonspecific. They can inject whatever you put into them. So this is a really interesting situation here. It reminds me of the whole rattlesnake situation where you have this beautifully designed creature that's designed to kill. That surely looks like what anthrax is doing, and yet when you start dissecting the functionality of anthrax, you see really what makes it so lethal is just a very small part of what makes up the anthrax bacterium. And that's a pattern that we find over and over again. There are lots of pathogens in the world that are variations of benign, non-dangerous forms. It's unusual to find something like a group like snakes where everything is a carnivore and really good at it. That's actually fairly rare. Usually what we find, especially in the microbial world, is bacteria where close cousins aren't lethal at all, they don't cause anything. But then this one causes tuberculosis or some horrible disease. Variations, as I said, can often be small. That hypodermic needle and the lethal factor, those are just two genes that are found in part of the anthrax genome, on a plasmid specifically. And if it didn't have that plasmid, it would not cause the anthrax disease. And as I said, some features appear to be designed. So were they designed as part of the fall? Are they misused features of the original benign creation? Did God come into the garden and say, all right, well, I'm going to have to rework things now because stuff's going to die? I think that's possible. And of course, what about the predators and the parasites? How does any of this relate to things like rattlesnakes and lions and eagles that are really well designed to hunt and kill? All right, moving along then, biosystematics. This is a really old idea in creationism. Dates back to before Darwin. This is not commonly known because the right people aren't reading the right books. The wrong people are reading the right books, and the right people are reading the wrong books. If the right people read the right books, they'd discover these cool things where all sorts of people prior to Darwin are sort of playing around with this idea that, well, these species are really highly variable, and they're malleable. We can make new ones. And maybe God made something else, different category of creature. The Brahman here is usually what we refer to in creationist biology. This is the sort of the technical name for created kind. It comes from the word bara, which is create in Hebrew, and min, which is kind. And it refers to those groups of creatures that God made in the garden in the beginning. And to put it really simply, should everything go on one evolutionary tree? Are we all related to one common ancestor, or are there limits? Does it end at some point? Is it really more like a forest of trees, where I share a common ancestor with other people in this room, but I do not share a common ancestor with a cat? And a cat might be related to a jaguar, but they're not related to a whale or a bat. And that's really what we're after here in this issue of created kinds. Let me pause for a minute. So to illustrate this, here's a nice little evolutionary tree. Got some critters on there. We've got furry things on the far right, and feathered things, and scaly things, and slimy things, and squishy things, and then on the far left, the crunchy things. So they're all related. on this evolutionary tree to these common ancestors here at the very base of the tree. And if you're trying to understand, do these things belong on one evolutionary tree, there's a bit of a problem, because anytime you want to make an evolutionary tree, the program that you use will give you an evolutionary tree. It's guaranteed to happen every time. So if you want to know, is there more than one evolutionary tree, well, what are you going to do? You have a program that will give you an evolutionary tree. So you got to come up with something else. So what I've tried to do in my research is apply clustering methods. Clustering methods is a whole area of statistical analysis which basically tries to take similarities and differences and arrange them in some sort of graphical way to tell you these things are similar and these things are different. So to illustrate that, I've taken that tree here and I've distributed the critters out in sort of a cluster. So I have the mammals here, they're close to the birds, and the birds are close to the reptiles. Mammals and birds are warm-blooded. They're more similar than mammals and reptiles. But birds and reptiles have a number of skeletal similarities which put them together that they don't share with mammals. But way over here, we have other things that are very different that I've put far away. So the closer things are, the more similar they are. Farther away, the more dissimilar they are. I'm going to talk a lot about this when I talk about created kinds. I'll do one tomorrow and I'll do one later in the week as well. So if you're really interested in what I'm doing here, you want all the gory details, that's the place to come. To simplify things, I'm just going to use dots to represent critters, and we'll, proceed from there. And I want to emphasize here, this is really important, because there's a lot of biologists who get real cranky when I do this. Biology is not math. Yes, I know biology is not math. This is representational of real creatures. So try not to overreact. So here's some examples from my research. It's a group of grasses here. This group represents probably 50 different groups of grasses, things like oats and wheat and corn. Basically, if it's on your breakfast table, it's probably a grass. Over here we have various plants that are very similar to grasses, but are in fact not grasses. These guys are sort of, they're classified as grasses, but you can see they're not part of the cluster that is the grasses. And in fact, you can test that in other ways and show that that is in fact what's going on there. That there are things that are grasses and there are things that are not grasses. And the clustering clearly separates these two away from the main grass cluster, which is really interesting. So if you're thinking about, is there really a tree? Well, I don't know. Maybe there is a tree. This would suggest there's something fundamentally unique and interesting about grasses that's different from other plants. Same pattern I find in iguanas. The blue guys here are iguanas, various iguanid lizards, and then over here we have in red other lizards that are not iguanas, like chameleons. And notice right in between we have this massive gap between other lizards and iguanas. Now, if you're looking carefully, you might say, look at this gap over here between this group of iguanas and this group of iguanas over here. And you know what? That might be a real gap. Other statistical tests I can run on this don't really support that as a gap, but it's entirely possible that there's more than one group of iguanas. I'm okay with that. It doesn't really matter. The point here is that there are discrete groups. There's not one group blending into another group. There are discrete groups that seem to be separate. Now, every now and then these things surprise me. These are horses. And what surprises me about the horses, these are fossil horses, Hyracotherium here, and Epihippus and Orohippus all the way up to what we have as modern horses here. Two different ways of analyzing the horse results. And what I found surprising about this was how how well this diagram in both analyses matched up with the stratigraphy of the fossils. So Eocene is one of the lowest, it's not the lowest, but it's the second lowest fossil layer in the Cenozoic. And then here is the Oligocene, which is the next one up, and the next one up is the Miocene, which are all these guys. And then, let's see, Pliocene and Pleistocene over there, the white one. Same pattern over here. Other statistical tests tell me that this is really all one cluster. There's not more than one cluster here. And so I basically took the unpopular position that these are probably representing a single created kind. And the pattern that you find there is reflective of the pattern of diversification of this created kind after the flood. It was unpopular because horse evolution has been a whipping boy for creationists for as long as there have been people arguing for horse evolution. Literally, I find anti-horse evolution stuff in creationist literature from the 1800s. People have always hated horse evolution. So here I am, cocky little new guy in the 21st century saying, maybe we got it wrong. Maybe this is really good evidence for creation. What's really interesting about horses, they're sort of similar to paleotheres, but other than that, they're really not similar to anything in the fossil record. And they're not really similar to anything living either. You know what the closest thing in the living world to a horse is? A rhinoceros. In the world, they're really different, right? So horses are really different from other things. They're not like other things. So again, you still have the same pattern. You have these clusters that are separate but similar to one another. So questions here, do these methods really work? We need more analyses, we need more methods. I'm really looking forward to hopefully developing some new techniques here in the near future that will be able to sort of independently test these conclusions. And of course, the big question, can we apply this to people? And if we do, what do we get? And you'll have to come back later in the week to find out, because I'm definitely going to talk about that. It's very cool. All right.
Dr. Wood, can I ask you a quick question?
You can.
When you did your comparison, are you doing it based strictly on physical characteristics? Or
Yes.
actually using genetic
Yes.
information?
Yes, I use physical characteristics. Absolutely. In fact, I use exactly the same thing that the evolutionary biologists use. And what was that message? I'm sorry? Repeat the question. Oh, did I use physical characteristics, or was there something else? And it's physical characteristics. Yeah, I didn't use any genetic stuff on this. Genetics is something separate, which is actually going to come up right now. So speciation. So now we've seen some created kinds. Are they really created kinds? Maybe. But we can actually look at this slightly differently. We do find evidence that created kinds contain more than one species. So if they contain more than one species, where do the species come from? And go through a number of arguments here, but there's a lot of reason to believe that there was a rapid burst of speciation immediately after the flood. And it was very quick, and then it was over. And it's pretty much been minor adjustments since then. So that means whatever's happening is not random. It's not random variation, and natural selection, that Darwinian mechanism, isn't something that we can just bring into creationism. It doesn't work that way. It's too fast, and it's too specific. So what my other research interest is comparative genomics. Is there some way that I can take two things that I think belong to the same created kind and compare their genomes and figure out something about how they changed? And the answer is, yeah, cool. We can totally do that. So what's a genome? Genome, all the DNA of an organism, all the chromosomes, all the genes. It's the inheritable stuff that instructs a cell. It gives the basic recipe to the cell for how to make a critter. It's not a terribly good definition, but we'll go with that. So one example here of this is sunflowers. So in this diagram, I've got 3 different sunflower species here, Annuus, Anomalous, and Petiolaris. These are all members of Helianthus, which is the sunflower genus. And these blocks represent pieces of chromosomes. These are detectable in an old method called genetic mapping. So this is a pretty old paper here. And what we find when we do that, let's focus right here on this segment that's labeled R, that contains at least 2 genes here that have been mapped in these 3 different species to 3 completely different segments. In Annuus, R is connected to Q, so that's a piece of the chromosome that is physically connected on a single chromosome, and R is next to Q. In Anomalous, R is physically next to S, and in Petiolaris, R is physically adjoined to T. So it appears in this case where we have something where these sunflowers are extremely similar, you would not mistake them for anything other than sunflowers, they end up have these genomes that seem to be rearranged, physically rearranged. Another example here, I'm comparing in this diagram, this is the lab strain of E. coli to the nasty strain of E. coli that people talk about when they talk about E. coli contamination, right? People eat something that's contaminated with E. coli, it's not usually the lab stuff, it's this nasty thing. And everywhere there's a dot, I've placed that dot because that's where they share a gene in common. And you can see these 2 E. coli strains, they're the same species, but they have significant differences in gene location. There's plenty of places where the genes are all in the same order. There are plenty of places where the genes have been moved all over the place. And there are other places where the genes have been flipped around and reinserted backwards, which is interesting. And there's plenty of other examples that I can point to. It appears that genomes are really fluid, and they appear to be capable, and not just capable, but designed for modification. You can scramble them up and come up with something slightly different, all within the same created kind. What we don't know is exactly whether that then leads to new species, or is it just something that happens? Is it just random stuff, or is it going to bring us something really new? And that's a really big new field of creationist research that would benefit from a lot of new blood. Biogeography then. How did animals spread over the earth after the flood? That's the main question. There's also the question of how did God create animals in places prior to the flood, but that's more of a question for, well, geology really, and the fossil record. Various creationist ideas. One creationist idea would be, well, after the flood you have a very warm ocean, you have a very cool continental interior, which means most of the vegetation recovery is going to be along the coastline. So that's where all the animals will be, and so the animals are just going to distribute along the coast. Interesting possibility. Still doesn't get you out to islands, but it gets you around most of the world. Others have proposed that people carried them, and that works pretty well for livestock, pets, vermin. Not sure that it works for things like rattlesnakes. Maybe the rattlesnakes followed the vermin, I don't know. But it works reasonably well. But there's also this other idea that that some animals, especially those going to islands, may have rafted on debris. And I started thinking about this when I learned about Mount St. Helens, and I know Dr. Austin's talked about Mount St. Helens here at the conference already. One of the things that happened at Mount St. Helens during the eruption was this massive debris flow that flowed down the north slope of the mountain into Spirit Lake, which is on the north side of the mountain. As it went, when it hit that lake, all the water was washed up out of it, created this giant tidal wave, which then annihilated the old growth forest around it and washed all those trees back into Spirit Lake, where they are still floating today. You can go on Google Maps if you have a phone or a gadget right now and look up Mount St. Helens. Of course, keep this open in the background, please. But You can go there, and then you can see on Spirit Lake, it's just a little bit north of the mountain. You zoom in on it close enough, and you'll see the trees floating there. The debris mat is still visible. So I was thinking about that and thinking about, what was the old growth forest like before the flood? And if you took all of those trees and threw them into the water, what kind of a debris mat would you create? And could that be a way to move animals rapidly from continents to islands? So case in point here, the Galapagos Islands. They are 600 miles from the nearest mainland, which is the west coast of South America. They are off the coast of Ecuador. Number of really cool critters live there that are only found in the Galapagos Islands. The giant tortoises, the marine iguanas, Darwin's finches, and a number of seabirds, including the unique Galapagos penguin. Now, what's interesting about the Galapagos, we see that there is a current that runs, an ocean current that runs right up the coast of South America and passes right by the Galapagos. In fact, it's probably only a 2-week trip from here to the islands. The other thing that we see is that these critters are pretty raftable. There's only a handful that we know of native mammals on Galapagos, and they're rats, rice rats. Otherwise, they're reptiles, which can go long periods of time without fresh water. Seabirds, which have these beautiful salt glands which allow them to drink seawater and survive that, and they get their food from the sea anyway. That's why they're seabirds. And these tiny little birds, which probably could have eaten little vegetation stuff on the debris mats or bugs or whatever. So these organisms are raftable. The organisms, the animals, the land animals that you find on these remote islands are not a random set of any old land animals. They're very specific sorts, like reptiles and birds and things like that, that are raftable. So if you had these giant rafts of debris after the flood, that could very well provide a way to raft those critters out to those islands. We have an example today. There was a report a few years ago of an Aldabran tortoise that washed up on the shore of Africa here. Aldabra is right here. It's in that big yellow circle, and several hundred miles away from the coast of Africa. And apparently some poor giant tortoise that lived in Aldabra got washed up on the shore of Africa after a traumatic sea journey. So it's possible. It's extremely rare today, but you could imagine a world in which there was debris that might actually facilitate the crossing. So how do we relate this to things like the fossil record and plate tectonics? That's a good question. How do we then also deal with the specific relationships of specific organisms? There's a lot of weird puzzles in biogeography, critters living in very strange places, and you wonder, how did they get there? All right, so recapping here, what I've tried to cover here is this notion that scientific ideas are not all the same. There are some ideas that are held for reasons that are very different from others, and there are high-level ideas, things you might call paradigms or core theories, that control other theories, the lesser stuff, the normal science. And we can have lots of really cool discussions about that low-level stuff because we all agree on the issues of creationism, right? So if we're all creationists, we can still talk about, well, what is the created kind? How do we identify them? What does the similarity mean? All that sort of thing. And when I was, newly minted scientist, we didn't have a real clear, what I consider to be a real clear roadmap for what biology might look like for creationists. There was the idea of the created kind of floating around. People talked a lot about evolution back then. 20 years since now that I'm not a student, there's been a lot of change in the creationist world. People are really starting to think more and more about these kinds of questions. So that's really very gratifying. And finally, what about people? And the answer is, you'll have to come back and find out later in the week. We're going to talk about the origins of people and what these research things have to do with that. So, as I said, look me up on Google, follow me on the internet. Core Academy is on Twitter as well. And thank you.